All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first Monday session for PPA 660. It was nice seeing everyone on Saturday, so it's nice to see names and faces again, and so I'm sure we'll get reacquainted over the next 6 weeks. But this is our first Monday session. What I have planned for tonight, we're not going to jump into everything right now, but just let you know on the agenda for tonight. We're going to cover some of the foundational aspects of organization theory. So we'll talk about things such as what is organization theory. We'll talk about why we bother studying organizations. We'll talk about some of the different approaches to studying organizations, macro and micro. We'll also take a real quick cursory look at some of the schools of thought that we'll be covering over the next 6 weeks. We'll also talk about some of the major differences between public and private organizations and the implications of those differences for how we develop theories to understand public versus private organizations. We'll then also talk about the three primary frameworks in the Tompkins textbook. And we'll talk about the models for organizational effectiveness. We'll talk about the mechanisms for control, and we'll talk about the methods for motivating employees and how we're going to use those three frameworks to compare our different theories and schools of thoughts throughout the course. And we'll probably be able to get all that done in the first half of class, then we'll take a break. After our break, we'll then do our breakout groups, and I have a quick little exercise that we can do in our breakout groups and hopefully get you in and out of here in about 2.5 hours tonight. So that is the goal for the evening. I did go and download all the 697 cases, and on Saturday we talked about from this course you're going to move into 697, and the cases you'll be doing in 697 are the same ones that are already published. And so you're going to be using the cases that are already available. And as I said, those cases are available on the Beachboard organization site. I went and took a look at the organization site, and it seems like several folks are enrolled in it. There are some folks who are not enrolled in it for whatever reason. So I thought the easiest thing to do is just download the cases and then upload them into our 660 organization theory site. So if you go into our Beachboard site, go under content, you'll see all the cases, all 5 cases, as well as instructions for those cases are all available in that 660 site. So if you have some extra time and you're curious about what the cases look like, you can access them there. Obviously, you're not going to be able to complete them and turn them in yet because the site we're going to use for submission is not operational yet. That's going to be the first section of 697 with Dr. Butts. I would assume that Beachboard site will probably be up and running by the end of May. So once that site is up and running, you can then work on those cases and submit them as you complete them. But you can at least get a little free preview of what the cases look like right there on our 660 organization theory Beachboard site. So I thought that was just the easiest way to do it. So that kind of covers that question from Saturday. Your first real assignment for this class then is due this coming Sunday. And again, what you're doing for that is providing a response to my prompt in Beachboard number 1 and then responding to at least 2 of your colleagues. It's a pretty basic assignment in that all you need to do is identify the organization that you plan on using for your organizational analysis paper, which is the post-instructional assignment for this course. And then tell me a little bit about it in terms of what's the purpose of the organization, what are some of the main functions of the organization. Now, I know, as I said on Saturday, if you have some concern about identifying your organization and, because eventually you're going to be pointing out flaws in the organization. If you're not comfortable doing that, you can always keep your organization anonymous. You can just refer to it as, if it's a county level agency, you could just say it's a large agency and the county will refer to it as agency A, and just call it agency A for all the assignments and all of your Beachboard posts. And I think that's a good way to keep it anonymous if you're concerned about identifying your organization. But I leave that completely up to you whether or not you want to identify the organization. For most folks, you're going to be using the organization where you are currently working. If you're not currently working in a public organization, if you're in a private sector organization, that will probably work as well. You're just going to be reverse engineering some of the logic that we talk about in this class. Rather than comparing public to private, you'll be comparing private to public. but it should still work. If you're in a nonprofit organization, that will work equally well, so no worries there. If for some reason you're not currently in an organization, then you'll choose an organization that you know about or you're familiar with, and then use that organization for your beach board post. So again, as I said on Saturday, when you're doing beach board number 1, and for all the beach board essays, I do recommend that initial post, you try and get that done sometime throughout the week, not waiting until Sunday to do it, because at least it means that there's something for other folks to respond to. Now your 2 responses, then you can obviously do over the weekend, but try and get that initial post done before the weekend if possible, just so we can have some actual discussion in the discussion forum. But your initial post and your 2 responses will then be due by midnight next Sunday. I'll then go through all of those, and I will then bring any information that I need to from those posts into our class for next Monday. And that's why I have everything due on Sunday, so that I'll have at least a day to look at it to bring in any information we need to for our next class session. So that's what you'll be doing this week. So it's kind of a light week from an assignment perspective. But on Saturday, we covered the course. We covered all the course objectives. We covered the course assignments, what we're doing, why we're doing it, when those assignments are due. I then provided a recording for Saturday's session up onto our Beachboard site, so that's available for you to review if you weren't in attendance on Saturday. And then every week, every Monday, I'll do the same thing. I'll record the session, make it available. Probably won't be available until very late tonight or very early on Tuesday morning. But since you've now had a couple of days to digest the material from Saturday about the course and course expectations, does anyone have any questions course related from what we covered on Saturday? Okay. All right. If anything occurs to you, as always, feel free to just shoot me an email, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. So let's go ahead then and get into some of our substantive information for the course. And hopefully you're able to see the PowerPoint slides. Yes? Okay, very good. So just to start at a very basic level of what is organization theory, I think we all have a decent idea. We know what a theory is, we know what an organization is. So we're kind of putting those 2 things together. So we know what a theory is an idea about how variables relate to each other. It's an idea about how the world works. So we're talking about organization theory. The theory is about how that organization functions and why that organization looks the way in which it does, and why it does the types of things that it does, why it exhibits the behaviors that it exhibits. So when we look at organization theory, we study several aspects of organizations. Some organization theories are really targeted towards studying structures. And that's what we see with the classical school of organization theory we're going to talk about next Monday. In the classical school, we really focus on the structure of the organization. So your organizational chart, the idea of a tall versus a flat hierarchy. And I'm sure from 500, you're very familiar with tall versus flat hierarchies. But a tall hierarchy is that pyramidal shape, whereby we have a singular person at the top of the organization. As you move down your organization structure, you encounter more and more positions. You get to the bottom of your organization structure, and that's where most of your positions are at, very pyramidal in nature. Most of our classical organizations exhibit that type of a tall hierarchy. But we're also aware of the fact that there are some public organizations, especially a lot of nonprofit organizations, that are much flatter in terms of their hierarchy. So you think of something like a regulatory commission at the federal level. That's a flatter type of hierarchy. You do not have one singular person at the top of the organization. You have multiple commissioners, 3 or 5 or 7 commissioners, which really does flatten the hierarchy a great deal. For the past 6 years, I served on a school board. And a school district is another example, at least at the very top, of being much flatter in nature. In that, yes, you have a superintendent, but that superintendent is hired by and responsible to the school board. So you've got 5 school board members. Similar type of thing with the city council. 5 city council members and a city manager that then serves at the pleasure of that city council. That is a big difference between a tall hierarchy and a flat hierarchy, because a tall and flat hierarchy, they're going to act a lot differently in terms of things such as communication. So communication may flow a little bit better perhaps in a flat hierarchy as compared to a tall hierarchy. The behaviors exhibited by tall hierarchies and flat hierarchies will also probably differ between those organizations. So another thing we study in organization theory is we study behaviors, how organizations behave in going about their daily functions. One thing that we have learned from the organization theory literature is that as organizations age, they tend to become much more complex in nature. As organizations age, they create more positions. Their organizational chart becomes much more complex. They adopt a lot of additional policies and procedures. I'll give you an example. Before I came to Cal State Long Beach, I was on faculty at a university in Florida, Florida Gulf Coast University. It's a state university in the Florida State University system, but it's the newest state university in Florida. And I arrived there in 2000, and the university had just been founded by the Board of Trustees 3 years before that. So I got there 3 years after the university started. At that point, we had about 1,000 students. I think today Florida Gulf Coast has about 20 to 25,000 students. When I got there, being a new organization, it was a very flat hierarchy. We didn't have a lot of policies and procedures. I started, along with a colleague of mine, a new undergraduate program in political science. And to start that program, we went to the provost and we said, what do we need to do? What are the policies to start this program? And the provost said, I don't know, you write them. We don't have any policies. So in putting together the program, my colleague and I had to actually write the policy, the procedures for how new programs are created at the university. We didn't have a lot of those policies and procedures. Now, if you're in an older organization, your organization probably has a regimen of procedures. You probably have a policy and procedure manual. That's what happens to older organizations. How does that affect behavior? Well, as organizations get older, they begin to exhibit this thing known as institutional rigidity. They get bigger, they become more complex, they become more reliant upon policies, procedures, and regulations. As organizations become more institutionally rigid, they start to build up barriers between the organization and the constituents the organization is supposed to serve. Once you build up those barriers between the organization and the folks you're supposed to be serving as an organization, you end up creating a lot of animosity between the public and the organization. And this is where public organizations end up getting a lot of the bad rep that they get in terms of being gridlocked, in terms of being unresponsive and uncaring. A lot of that comes from this institutional rigidity. Their behaviors change as they age and as they become more complex. There's a great book, and I don't know if you've read it yet so far in the MPA program, but there's a great book from a few decades ago, and it's written by Charles Goodsell. And the book is called The Case for the Bureaucracy. And in the case for the bureaucracy, Goodsell makes the argument that most public organizations and bureaucracies in general are held in very low regard by the public. And the reason why they're held in that low regard is because of the experience people have had with those agencies. So he gives the example, someone may have 100 interactions with a public agency. If that final interaction, that 100th interaction, is a negative experience for that person is then going to have a negative perception of that organization and in turn, the entire bureaucracy. One bad experience with one organization can really change the person's perception of the entire bureaucracy. And so the argument Goodsell makes is that what organizations have to do is they have to be more proactive in their behaviors. They need to demonstrate to the public just how important the organization is to the everyday life of an individual citizen. The members of the public usually don't think much about just how every aspect of their lives will be touched by a government organization in one form or another. From the safety standards for the mattress that they sleep on, to the toothpaste that they use and the regulations in terms of consumer safety for the toothpaste they use to brush their teeth in the morning, to the quality of the food that they eat for breakfast, to the fuel standards and safety standards for the car they get in to drive to work. The road they're driving on is probably paid for with taxpayer money. And some government organization made the decision where to build that road, what to use in building that road, when that road needs to be renovated, and so on and so on. And so Goodfellow says it's important to show people that the behaviors of public organizations are not all bad, and that these behaviors exhibited by public organizations really form the basis of our everyday lives as citizens. So we study those behaviors on the part of organizations. And we'll talk about, as we go through all of our different theories and schools of thought, we'll talk about how different theories approach this idea of organizational behavior. Some will focus on policies and procedures and the behavior of the organization in adhering to policies and procedures. Some will focus on the behaviors in terms of how they interface and interact with citizens. And so a lot of different ways we can look at those behaviors of organizations. Some of those behaviors of organizations are going to tie the organization to their surrounding environment. And so sometimes when we study organization theory, we study the external pressures being placed upon public organizations by their respective environments. Something like systems theory, for example. When we talk about, we'll spend an entire week on systems theory. We'll talk a lot about the two-way street in the relationship between a public organization and its environment. How does the environment affect the organization? How then in turn does the organization affect the environment? There are a lot of characteristics in environments that can have both positive as well as negative impacts upon organizations. So we hope that we have a supportive environment that is capable of sustaining the public organization. Some of the resources organizations need from their external environment are things such as money, appropriations. So does the external environment provide adequate appropriations to the agency to carry out its functions? An adequate pool of labor is something else the environment can provide to the organization. If you don't have an adequate pool of labor, potential workers who are skilled enough to do the job, obviously you're not going to be able to get your work done as an organization. Political support. How much political support is there out in the environment for what the organization is doing, and so on and so on. So environments can have a big impact upon the organization. We study that in organization theory. But we also recognize that it's a two-way street, and that public organizations can also have a major impact upon their external environment. So organizations can affect their environment through the quality of the services that they provide, through the quantity of the services that they provide. A lot of ways that they can have that impact upon their environment. So, and not to get too much into systems theory too soon, we've got a few weeks for that, but in essence, what you have is kind of this symbiotic relationship between the organization and the environment, where you have an inflow and outflow of resources between the organization and its surrounding environment. And we study that in organization theory. We also study the relationship between the organization and the members of that organization. How much do the organization support the wants, needs, and desires of its employees? And then what types of contributions do employees provide to the organization to help the organization achieve its goals? An example of that is we'll look at Chester Barnard, and we'll look at Barnard's theory of the zone of indifference and the need for the organization to obtain the compliance on the part of its employees. So managers can only be successful, according to Barnard, if they're able to extract contributions from their employees that will then make the goals of the organization possible. Well, how do they extract those contributions? Clearly, they do it through providing incentives. So the leader or the manager will provide incentives to those employees. Those employees, if they value those incentives, it will then induce them to provide more contributions. The more contributions provided to the organization, the more likely the organization is to achieve its goals. So in organization theory, we're very interested in, again, that two-way relationship between the organization and the employees within the organization. So really, organization theory is a very big catch-all type of term. And there are a lot of things that we study when we study organization theory. There are also multiple ways we can go about studying organizations. And the three primary approaches to viewing organization theory are the macro, micro, and management-oriented approaches. So the macro level approach, we are going to focus our attention on the organization itself. We're going to look at the structure of the organization. We're going to look at how the organization is organized. We're going to look at what the organization, the structure of the organization means for the outputs and the outcomes of that organization. And you've been in the MPA program now for you're about halfway through at this point. So you're probably familiar with this distinction between outputs and outcomes. When we're talking outputs, we're usually talking about the actual services and the products that are being produced by the organization. Those are the organization's outputs. The outcomes are then the consequences to those who consume those outputs. So, say for instance, one of the goals of our organization is to try and enhance the quality of life of low-income residents. And so we create an income subsidy program whereby we do a direct cash transfer of, say, $600 per month. It's kind of like a basic income type of program, where we do a direct cash transfer of $600 per month into the accounts of eligible households. That $600 per month, that's the output. That's what we are creating as an organization. The outcome, the consequence, is then the impact that $600 will have on the disposable income of those low-income households. So does it make a material difference to them? So that extra $600 means that it gives them more disposable income, more income to spend after they've already purchased the staples of life. Is it having the impact that we want it to have? But in this macro level approach, our unit of analysis from a research perspective is the organization itself. People like Max Weber, who we'll talk about next week, really took very much of a macro level, organizational level type of approach. Now, it's kind of common for the classical school of organization theory. The second approach to viewing organizations is through a micro lens. In the micro level approach, we start to focus on the elements within the organization, the people in the organization, units and divisions within the organization, and groups that form the organization, whether they be formal or informal groups. We look at the components within the organization, and that becomes the unit of analysis for our study in a micro level type of an approach. Where do you see the micro level approach? You see that prominently in human resource management theories, some of the more modern theories that really do place a value upon individual employees and how there's a bigger goal than just the organization's goal. And another equally important goal is to help our employees develop as human resources. And that's a much more micro level type of an approach. Then a third approach is a management-oriented approach. And in a management-oriented approach, we will focus on the processes and the practices that are occurring within the organization. So we will study the hiring practices of the organization. We will study how the organization does performance evaluation, how the organization engages in the training and development function. And so this is where we kind of dig down into what's actually going on to manage the daily operations of that organization. Again, it's kind of how the organization, the individual interact in order to accomplish ultimate goals. This macro, micro, and management approach is kind of similar to the development of the literature in political science. If you were an undergraduate major in political science, you're probably familiar with the way in which political science literature developed. My PhD is actually in political science, and so I kind of see this relationship very clearly. in the political science literature, back in the 1940s and the 1950s, the approach was very much of an institutional approach. It was a macro level approach. So political scientists focus on things such as Congress as an institution, the office of the presidency, the Supreme Court. They focus on organizations, on institutions. Once the literature then developed and evolved into the 1960s and the 1970s, it started looking more at a micro level approach, where it became a much more individualistic approach, studying the behaviors of members of those institutions. So rather than studying the US Congress, like Woodrow Wilson would have done in the late 1800s, we start studying the decision-making of individual members of Congress, much like a John Kingdon would do. So why do people do what they do? Members of Congress do what they do. Why do presidents act the way in which they do? How does the behavior of this president differ from this president, and why do their behaviors differ? We look at the composition of the Supreme Court, the individual justices, and we study the individual decisions of individual justices rather than just looking at, is it a 5-4 or a 6-3 vote of the entire court as a whole? So a much more micro approach. Then as you get into more modern political science, you merge the two together. And instead of just looking at the institution or the individual, you look at how they interact with each other. So how do the behaviors of members of Congress affect the institution of Congress itself? So if you have a bunch of members of Congress who want to get rid of the filibuster, and they are successful at getting rid of the filibuster, you have fundamentally changed the institution of Congress. That's kind of this third approach. So to put it in the terms of organization theory, again, we're looking at what goes on within our organization and the actual relationships between members of the organization and the organization itself. And those relationships usually take the form of the processes and practices the organization goes through on a daily basis to create its outputs. And then hopefully if those outputs are quality outputs and are geared appropriately, they will then have the desired benefits and consequences for the members of the public who are consuming those outputs being produced by the organization. So keep the macro and the micro and the management approach to studying organizations in mind as we go throughout this entire course, because as you'll see, as we talk about different schools of thought, we're going to highlight different approaches. Some will highlight macro, some micro, and some management. So as I told you on Saturday, one of the reasons I use the Tompkins book, even though it is an older publication, is because of the chronological coverage of the different schools of thought. So the different schools of thought we are going to cover in this class. We're going to start with classic bureaucratic theory. And in classic bureaucratic theory, we're going to talk about people like Max Weber. We'll talk about a school of thought known as scientific management, which will get us into Taylor and a little bit more into what we call the principal school with Luther Gulick. We'll talk about administrative management with people like Henri Fayol. The way in which we're going to do it in this class is we're going to combine all those together into what we consider to be the classical approach to studying an organization. So the Weber, the Taylor, the Gulick, the Fayol, we're going to put together into our discussion next week. And we're going to call it the classical approach to studying organizations. Then the following week, we will get into what we call the neoclassical approaches. So newer than classical approaches. And in those neoclassical approaches, we're going to talk about schools of thought such as human relations and human resource management. I make a distinction between the two when we talk about them. We cover them both in the same week, but we will distinguish between a human relations approach and a human resource management approach. And that distinction will become clear in a couple of weeks when we get to talking about those different schools. But in the human relations school, we'll talk about people like my favorite author, Mary Parker Follett. We'll spend a good deal of time talking about Mary Parker Follett. We'll talk about Elton Mayo, who you've probably run into before. At least you ran into him in 500, if not another course in the program. And then we'll talk about human resource management theory. And we'll talk about people like Abraham Maslow and Douglas McGregor and Chris Ardress. But those are what we're going to call the neoclassical school, where we kind of move away from the macro approach and we start looking more at the micro approach and really starting to look at those individual employees within the organization. And they become our unit of analysis in our study of public organizations. Week after that, we'll talk about systems theory. And we'll start talking about that relationship between the organization and its external environment. We'll talk about people like Katz and Kahn. We'll go back and pick about Chester Barnard again. We cover Barnard a couple different times in this class. And we'll talk about that relationship between the organization and its environment. We'll also talk about structural functional theory, and we'll focus on someone by the name of Robert Merton, who really starts to talk more to us about management. And so he's talking to us about those processes and procedures and how we can make those processes and procedures better reflect the wants, needs, and desires of our constituents who will be consuming the outputs that we are creating. We'll really get into processes and procedures and a managerial type of approach when we talk about quality management. And we'll spend a little bit of time near the end of the semester talking about quality management and its application for the public sector. And we'll talk about some of the aspects of quality management that don't apply very well to the public sector, but we will talk about how public organizations adopt the quality management and this real focus on the management function of organizations. And then we'll round out our discussion this term talking about things like organization culture and leadership, some more modern theories of organizations. We'll talk about how different organizations have their own unique culture, and we'll also talk about how leaders can then embed new cultures into their organization and how that has a major impact upon what the organization does, what the organization thinks, and how successful organizations are in achieving their ultimate goals and objectives. So we're going to take a very chronological approach in this class to covering all these different theories and all these different schools of thought. But as we do that, we're always going to look for those commonalities, and we're really going to take great pains to show the threads that tie all these different theories and all these different schools of thought together. Because as I mentioned on Saturday, whenever we get the development of a new school of thought, a new approach to studying organizations, that new approach to studying organizations is usually predicated upon criticisms and flaws with the approach that predated it. So the neoclassical school was generated out of basically a rejoinder or a response to the problems that were identified in the classical school. The system school came about because of some of the problems that were identified in the human resource management school, and so on and so on. So I really want to try and give you this, again, this continuous thread, this, you can call it connective tissue, if you will, that connects all the different theories and schools of thought that we will be covering. One of the problems I have found in a lot of organization theory courses, I've taken them at the master's level, at the doctoral level, is that sometimes you just get inundated with theories and with theorists, but you don't really spend a lot of time talking about how they relate to each other. And I really want you to walk away from this class with a really good understanding of the connective tissue that connects all these schools of thought together and kind of gives us the nature of the chronological evolution and development of our understanding of public organizations. But our focus is going to be squarely on public organizations. We know that if you're over in the Business College of Business in an MBA program, you can also take and would also be required to take organization theory and analysis classes. But there is a difference between how they do what they do over in the College of Business and what we do over in the Graduate Center for Public Policy. Because our organizations, even though they share some similarities, do have some substantial differences. And I don't know in 500 if you read the Graham Allison article, but Graham Allison has a great article that illustrates the differences between public and private organizations, and really on a larger basis, differences between the public and the private sector. And just as a refresher, if you've already read Allison or if you haven't read Allison yet, Allison's argument is that there are some distinct similarities between public and private organizations. Those similarities are basically in terms of what we refer to as generic management theory. There are some generic management strategies and functions that all managers do, regardless of what sector they are working in. So regardless of whether you're in a private organization or a public agency, or even a nonprofit organization, you are going to engage in things such as staffing. You're going to have to hire people, recruit them, hire them to fill necessary positions in your organization. You're going to have to determine how to select people to work in your organization. You're going to have to train people and onboard them into your organization. All those, you have to pay people, put them on payroll. All those staffing functions occur both in the private as well as the public sector. All organizations, both public as well as private, need money to survive. If you don't have money to survive, you're going to go out of existence. Where that money is derived from will differ. So in the private sector, you're deriving that money from profits, from selling goods and making a profit. In the public sector, you're oftentimes deriving that revenue from appropriation. So it's a much more stable form of revenue. But either way, all organizations need money. So budgeting is a function that both public and private sector managers do. You need support. In the private sector, you need support from your customers. In the public sector, you need support from your citizens as well as from elected officials. So there are generic management functions that occur in both sectors. But according to Allison, the big difference is not the function, but rather how that function is carried out, how managers do those functions. And that's the major difference between the two sectors. So how we hire, obviously, it's a lot different between the private and the public sector. Private sector employees are at-will employees. As such, they can be hired very quickly. You can go to a job interview with a private corporation. If that interview goes very well, they'll send you downstairs or upstairs or wherever the HR department is, put you on payroll, and you'll be starting the next day. It can be that quick. In the public sector, as you probably are aware of getting your job in a public organization, it's usually a much more protracted process. It could take you 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, maybe up to a year in order to get hired into a public organization. So even though all organizations do hiring, how it's done in the public sector looks a lot different than how it's done in the private sector. Same thing with budgeting. How we budget in the public sector is different than the private sector. In the private sector, we derive our money from profits. In the public sector, we get it from appropriations. So we have much more stable sources of funding for public organizations. Well, so what? My favorite question in all my classes is, so what? Well, so what? So there's a difference in the stability of revenue between public and private sector. But when you have stable revenue sources, you don't have to worry about going out there and earning a profit. And so some will argue that there's less of an impetus for creativity in the public sector. There's less of a mandate to save money and be efficient in the public sector because these appropriations, for the most part, are going to be coming year after year after year. In the private sector, you don't know that. And so you really try and do more with less, and you really try and be as efficient as possible. So it's not the what that's different, but it's the how that's different between the two sectors. And that's Allison's primary argument. The title of his article are public and private organizations, are they unlike in all fundamentally unimportant respects? And his final answer to that is they are like, and yeah, they're kind of unimportant in that they're generic functions. It's really the difference is in how organizations go about carrying out those functions. So we know public organizations are different. And so the way in which we generate our theories to study public organizations will be different than how we generate theories to study private organizations. One reason why our theories tend to be different is because of the power and authority structures for public organizations versus private organizations. Public organizations exist through law. So an organization, a public agency, is created through enabling legislation. That enabling legislation then gives legal standing to that organization. Private corporations are usually not created directly out of enabling legislation, so they don't have the same authority basis that a public sector organization may have. We have to be mindful of that as we develop our theories for understanding those organizations. So there's a different authority basis between the sectors. It's on a very basic level. When you think about a government and you try to identify whether or not something is a government, we usually use two main criteria to determine if something's a government. One criteria is the control over a jurisdiction. Governments typically are governments if they have control over their jurisdiction. The second major criteria is coercive power. Do they have the ability to coerce their residents, their citizens, to take an action they otherwise would not take? And when we talk about the word power, that's usually what we are talking about. It's the ability to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do. Typically, most people will not serve on a jury unless they are compelled, coerced through jury duty notices. So that's a power of authority. That's a way in which we can influence them to take that action. Everyone probably won't pay their taxes on April 15th, which, not to freak anyone out, but just as a reminder, coming up on Friday. On April 15th, or actually this year, it's April 18th, I'd like to point out. For the federal government, it's April 18th this year. We may not willingly want to pay our taxes by April 18th unless we are coerced to do so. If you don't pay your taxes, there will be some penalties that will be associated with that failure to pay. So governments oftentimes have that type of power and authority basis that the private sector counterparts may lack. So we have to understand that in developing our theories. External influences. Public organizations operate in more open environments than private sector organizations. We always say we serve many masters in the public sector. And by serving many masters, the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, we have a lot of scrutiny from the media. We have citizens, scrutiny from citizens. We have all these external influences that we need to account for in our public organization theories, much more so than in private organization theories. Our goals and objectives in public organizations also tend to be much different. As you know from your time in the program, we tend to have what we call softer goals and objectives in our organizations. So in your private sector organization, your goal may be to sell the most product in order to generate the highest amount of profit. That's all well and good. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's a quantitative type of outcome. We can measure that. We can measure that goal by looking at sales last year compared to this year, looking at how much revenue we generate. In the public sector, we're oftentimes dealing with outcomes such and goals such as enhancing the quality of life of an individual. Now, enhancing the quality of life of an individual can be a relatively subjective type of thing to try and measure. And as you get into 697, I believe the case you'll be working on for research methods deals with this question of quality of life. You're looking at participation in a program and the impact of participation in that program on enhancing the quality of life of returning soldiers. Quality of life, even though we can come up with some empirical measurements, much more difficult to measure than just the profit over in the private sector. So we have those softer goals. We have to take that into account with our theories as well. And we also have to take into account the fact that public organization managers are subject to a lot more limitations on what they can do and how they can do it than their private sector counterparts. The programs that we are implementing in our organizations in the public sector are again created by enabling legislation. So therefore, they are guided by legal requirements. And we are going to be limited legally in terms of exactly what we can do in implementing that program or that policy. We're going to be very limited in terms of how we spend our money. If you deal in public finance, you know the requirement for doing audits. Sometimes there are annual audit requirements. Sometimes you do audits a couple of times a year. You're oftentimes required to do not only legal or financial audits, but also performance management audits. So we've got a lot of legal requirements. We know that there are some things we can spend out of our general fund, and there are some things we can't spend on out of our general fund. We know that, for instance, in my district, we passed a bond measure, $148 million bond measure back in 2014. And we had our teachers union coming to us and saying, well, we've got all this bond money, we need a raise. And the response had to be, we can't pay you a raise out of the bond money. The bond money is legally obligated to only be spent on the projects that were approved by the voters in the ballot measure. You are precluded legally from spending that bond money on any types of salaries for your teachers. And that was kind of a hurdle we had to get over to kind of point out those legal limitations in how we can spend the money. The money is just not all thrown into a single pot. As you know from budgeting, you have fund-based accounting. And so you have different funds for different types of expenditures. We have these procedural limitations in the public sector, much more so than in the private sector. And one of the main reasons for that is we're dealing with civil service employees. So as we carry out our human resource management function, we are doing so with civil service employees, and civil service employees who are oftentimes unionized. So we not only have to follow the procedural requirements under civil service code, we also have to follow the procedural requirements in the collective bargaining agreement. So far more procedural requirements. We have to take that into account when we develop our organizational theories. And obviously the political limitations. We are doing this in a political environment. In PPA 500, you read Woodrow Wilson and his study of administration. And you talked about the politics administration dichotomy. And by now you're very familiar with the fact that there is not a clear distinction between the political side of the house and the administrative side of the house. We do administration within a very political environment. Public managers oftentimes are involved in politics in the formulation of policy. And so we really get that blurring of the line. We're in a very political environment as compared to our private sector counterparts, again, that need to be considered in the development of our public organization theories. So all of this is to say that business models oftentimes do not work in public organizations. Now, that's not to say we have not borrowed liberally from the world of business for some of our theories. Frederick Taylor, scientific management, comes directly from the world of business. Deming and quality management comes directly from the private sector. So we do borrow liberally from the private sector, but we have to realize that we can't just carte blanche take everything from the private sector and shoehorn it into our public organizations. Because again, we have our different goals and objectives, as we talked about in the previous slide. Business models oftentimes don't work in public organizations because of the second bullet point known as the principal-agent relationship. If you haven't talked about the principal-agent relationship yet, it's a very important concept in public administration. Public organizations are subject to oversight by elected bodies. And so if you're a federal agency, you are directly subject to the oversight of the U.S. Congress. In that relationship, Congress serves as the principal, the agency serves as the agent. So typically you would think, if you were in the private sector, the principal, the overseer, should have the power and the information and should have more power and more information than those organizations they are meant to oversee. It just kind of makes sense. One's the principal, one is the agent. In the public sector, we know that's not necessarily the case. Who knows better what goes on a daily basis in a public agency than that public agency itself? Than those, what Michael Lipsky would call street-level bureaucrats who are carrying out these policies and interfacing with the public on a daily basis. They know better than anyone what's going on within that agency. So the problem with the principal-agent relationship in the public sector is that the agency, the agent, oftentimes has more information than the principal, the overseer. And this happens a lot when you watch oversight hearings in Congress. So Congress will bring in the head of an agency to testify in this oversight hearing. Well, when that agency head comes in, that agency head has more information than the members of Congress who are questioning that agency head. That then produces what's known as a moral hazard. and this is part of the principal-agent relationship known as a moral hazard, the head of the public agency then faces a moral hazard whereby they must consider what information to provide to members of Congress and how much information they should provide. And they're caught in a quandary because they know if they do not provide the information to the members of Congress oftentimes don't even know what questions to ask. So they will not have the information they need to properly oversee this agency. But on the other side of the coin, if they give up too much information, then that information can be used against them, and it will create more scrutiny of their organization. So they're faced with this moral hazard, how much information to provide to members of Congress. That's a situation we see in the public sector, we oftentimes don't see in the private sector. So we need to recognize this principal-agent relationship in developing our public organization theories, and sometimes those private theories don't take into account the differential information asymmetry between the principal and the agent. We've already said because of the products that we are creating, the outputs we are creating, that our outputs and our outcomes are oftentimes difficult to quantify. They may be empirical, but they may be qualitative instead of quantitative. Most private business models focus on quantitative measurement. Sometimes we can't quantitatively measure what we are doing over here in the public sector. We also have difficulty in the public sector trying to measure performance, because if we have very subjective types of goals and objectives, if we have very qualitative outputs and outcomes, it becomes difficult for us to measure how well we are achieving those outputs and those outcomes. If it's difficult for you to measure the performance not only of your organization, but of employees in your organization, it then stands to reason it's difficult for you to then reward them for their performance. We have more limitations on rewards, especially extrinsic rewards in the public sector as compared to our friends in the private sector. Pay for performance is a very common standard in the private sector, far less common in public organizations. So it's not as easy as just taking these business models and applying them. We can take them, we can modify them to then make them fit what's going on in our public organizations. So that all gives us a justification, if you will, for why we study public organization theory. We need to develop our own unique theories to apply to public and nonprofit organizations. But even there, when we're talking about just in the world of public organization theory, one of the things we have learned throughout the evolution of the literature is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. You'll see when we talk about Max Weber and Frederick Taylor and Luther Gullig and Henri Fail next week, the classical school was really unified in their approach to trying to find the panacea, trying to find the cure-all, the one approach that will work in every organization. We have come to realize that's not possible. There are no panaceas because there are differences in public organizations that will recommend different types of models and theories. So when you think about our public organizations, they may all be public, but they look a whole lot different from each other. Our public organizations certainly differ in size. You've got some massive organizations like the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level. These are huge organizations. But then also at the federal level, we have an organization like the Marine Mammal Commission. The Marine Mammal Protection Commission, I believe is what it's called, is a commission made up of 12 marine biologists. And so that's a far smaller organization than the Department of Health and Human Services. So differing sizes means that what works for Department of Health and Human Services is not going to work for the Marine Mammal Protection Commission. Our organizations all have different structures as well. Again, some are tall hierarchies, very regimented structures. Some are much flatter and much more fluid in their structure. Different organizations have different functions. Some organizations do what we call direct administration, whereas other organizations are wholly engaged in indirect administration. As you probably know, the difference between direct administration and indirect administration An organization engaged in direct administration will interface directly with the citizens and will provide services directly to beneficiaries. In direct administration, you usually are providing the resources to make direct administration possible by other organizations. So we see a whole lot of direct administration at the local level. We see a lot more indirect administration at the federal and the state levels. So that will affect how we develop our theories for our organizations. We all have different environments for different organizations as well. And so do we have a supportive environment? Do we have an environment rich in resources, or do we not? We'll have to take that into consideration in developing different theories for those different types of environments. We know that even within public organizations, we have different types of employees. So you'll have a different type of employee if you're in a Department of Health as opposed to if you're in a transit authority. You know, for years in this distance learning program, before we really migrated into the online approach, when I first came to Long Beach, we provided our sessions through closed circuit TV. And so I would go up to the TV studio on campus and up at the top of Heartbreak Hill, as we call it. And I would go in there and we would then broadcast closed circuit to 3 different work sites. And we would just have employees who worked at those 3 different work sites that were part of the DL program. And so they would congregate around a table in a conference room at their place of work. It was horrible. We had one-way audio, so you talk and then you ask any questions, and then you talk a little bit more and ask any questions. And you'd have to ask questions of each individual site differently. It was a really clunky type of process. But when we did that, one of our major work sites was OCTA, the Orange County Transit Authority. And the vast majority of folks who we had in the program from OCTA were engineers. And they were taking the MPA program because they were moving up into management positions. So they wanted to learn more about human resource management and budgeting and managing organizations. But those employees who were working there were a lot different than employees we had working in the Department of Health. We typically had health-related degrees. We had some doctors. We had nurses in those programs. And so different employees means that one theory is not going to work across all different organizations. So we have to realize we have different employee bases, even within the public sector. And we also have organizations that use different types of technologies. And there is a theory from a theorist by the name of Thompson, and it's called, I like it because there's a lot of alliteration, Thompson's typology of technologies. Thompson's typology of technologies. Thompson tells us that in organizations, we tend to have 3 main types of technologies that are used. One type of technology is what he refers to as the long link technology. I'll put these in text chat. The long link technology. According to Thompson, a long linked technology is basically akin to an assembly line. So everyone's job is predicated upon someone else doing their job before them. It's like in an assembly line, someone puts the headlights on. And then someone else has a job of putting the grill on the car. And then it moves down the track, and then someone else has a job of putting the bumper on the car, or whatever the case may be. So it's a long link technology. You can really, in a linear fashion, follow how the technology occurs throughout the organization in producing the output. That's a very simple type of technology. But he says there are 2 other types of technologies as well. Second type of technology is what he calls a mediating technology. In a mediating technology, this is where you have, for instance, think about like an employment office or employment bureau. An employment bureau exists to try and link people with jobs. And so they get these listings of open positions and they try and match the person with the appropriate job. They're doing this mediating type of function between a person and the services available to that person. That's called mediating technology. And he says some of our public organizations do that. You can also think about a health organization. Health organizations do this all the time, where they'll link up patients with the types of services those patients need based upon their illness or their maladies. The third type of technology is much more difficult to manage, and that's what he calls the intensive technology. Intensive technology, according to Thompson, is when members of the organization interface directly with beneficiaries. And they have to treat each individual beneficiary differently depending upon the wants, needs, and desires of that individual beneficiary. So it's considered intensive because how you deal with citizen A may be much different than how you deal with citizen B, which is much different than how you deal with citizen C. Well, so what? Again, my favorite question. Well, the so what is you're going to need different theories depending upon what technology the organization's using. If you're using a long linked assembly line type of technology, you can get away with a very top-down standardized type of an approach to how work is being done. You can really use a quality management type of an approach. However, if you're dealing with a much more intensive technology, where how you interface with people will depend upon the individuals you're interfacing with, a top-down type of approach probably is not going to work that well, because how you define quality of service to citizen A will probably be defined differently with citizen B and citizen C, and so on and so on. So you're probably going to need a more bottom-up type of approach to managing the organization that uses intensive technology as compared to a long link technology. So if you want to get in my favorite answer, it depends. It would be more of an it depends answer for the intensive technology as compared to a long linked type of technology. So the moral of the story here is we know the differences between public and private sectors and why private sector models and theories oftentimes don't work well in public organizations. But even when we are in the world of public administration, there are significant enough differences between our organizations that panaceas just do not work. And we really need to take a more contextual approach to understanding how our organizations operate and developing the theories to help our organizations become more effective and more efficient. So fortunately for us, we have a lot of different theories that have been developed over the past 150 years that we can apply to our public organizations. And that's what we're going to spend the remainder of the class talking about, these different theories and these different schools of thought. As I told you on Saturday, the way in which we do it in this class is we use the frameworks presented to us by Tompkins. And so Tompkins presents to us 3 different frameworks that we can use to compare the different theories and schools of thought that are presented in the textbook as well as presented in class. And what we will do is as we cover each theory, at the end of talking about and discussing those theories, we will then turn our attention to these 3 frameworks. And we'll ask the question, where does this theory fit in terms of models of organizational effectiveness, methods of control, and methods of motivating our employees? And we'll use these frameworks then to draw those similarities and distinctions between all the different theories and schools of thought that we will cover. So I think it's instructive here at our first night to really delve into these 3 frameworks and make sure we have a really good understanding of what Tompkins means with these 3 frameworks that he will be using. So if you happen to have the Tompkins textbook with you, on page 28, he presents to us his first framework, which he refers to as the competing values framework, the 4 models of organizational effectiveness. And to be fair, he has taken this and he adapted it from a couple of other theorists named Quinn and Rohrbach. So it's not something that he created. He just did an adaptation of what Quinn and Rohrbach had developed earlier. But he presents to us 4 different models of organizational effectiveness, 4 different ways in which organizations can measure and attempt to achieve what they consider to be effectiveness. And the word effectiveness is kind of a tricky term. Years ago, I developed a class on effectiveness in the public sector. And one of our major goals in the class was to develop a definition of effectiveness. And in the first class session, I always ask students, what do you define as effectiveness and how do you define the word effectiveness? And the vast majority of people came back with, well, do we achieve our goal? If we achieve our goal, then we are effective as an organization. And I think that is a good way of measuring effectiveness, but I think that's only one way to measure effectiveness. When you look at the chart on page 28, you'll notice that at the bottom right, you've got 4 cells there. At the bottom right cell, you have what's called the rational goal model. And the rational goal model is one way of measuring effectiveness. And what he does here, before we actually get in the rational goal model, when you look at the chart, you'll notice that there are two axes. There's an x-axis and there's a y-axis. The x-axis will differentiate these models based upon where their focus lies. Is the focus within the organization in an internal focus, or is the focus external to the organization, looking more at the environment beyond the walls of the organization? So the models that focus on the external approach are going to be to the right of the chart. Those that focus more internally are going to be on the left side of the chart. And so we're going to differentiate between internal and external focus, left to right. Then the y-axis, at the top is flexibility, at the bottom is control. So those models that are on the top level of the chart are going to emphasize flexibility. Those at the bottom level of the chart are going to emphasize control. And so we've got that then creates a 2x2 matrix, 4 different cells. So at the bottom right, we have the rational goal model of effectiveness. It emphasizes both control as well as an external focus. As an external focus because our goals are oftentimes established for us. We can go through strategic planning in our organization, and we're doing that now as a department here at Long Beach, but you can go through a strategic planning process. You can come up with goals for your department, but those goals must fit within the overall goals of the organization. So here at Long Beach, we have this thing called Beach 2030, which you probably, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's been around for a while. And it's the strategic planning process for the university. So in Beach 2030, the university has its set of goals for the university. Then the College of Health and Human Services has its own set of goals that then fit within the goals of the university. And then the department, the Graduate Center for Public Policy and Administration, we're developing or revising our goals, and those revised goals fit within the college goals, and the college goals fit within the university goals. So we don't have complete freedom and flexibility in the establishment of our goals. Our goals must fit within the goals of the college and the university. Therefore, there is an external focus to our goals. The rational goal model really does focus on control. And so your ultimate goal here with rational goal model is to achieve your goals by being productive, achieve high levels of performance in the most efficient way possible so that you can achieve the goals of the organization. So goal attainment is the ultimate outcome that you are trying to achieve with a rational goal model. That's how you're defining the effectiveness of your organization. If you move above it, to the cell above, you have the open systems model. The open systems model favors flexibility, but still a focus on the external. So with that open systems type of model, what we are trying to do is we measure effectiveness by our ability to pull resources in from our external environment. So we are effective as an organization if we can successfully acquire resources from our external environment to help our organization survive. So our ultimate goal is growth and resource acquisition. We do that by adapting to our environment and being flexible to changes in that external environment. But we're looking externally and we're really emphasizing flexibility. But we define effectiveness as the ability to obtain those surplus resources. Shift over to the left. In the top left-hand corner, you have the human relations model of organizational effectiveness. It favors flexibility, but it also favors control. Here we're looking internal to the organization. It favors flexibility, but also favors the internal focus. We are looking inside the organization. So we're focusing internal to the organization on our human resources, on our employees. And our ultimate goal is to create a very cohesive, very motivated workforce. And we hopefully will do that by building morale, providing the right incentives to our employees, and helping our employees develop as human resources. So we can measure our effectiveness based upon how well we have developed our employees as human resources. So it's a different way of defining effectiveness. And then the bottom left, we have the internal process model of effectiveness. That is at the bottom, so it's favoring control. It's to the left because it's favoring an internal focus. The ultimate goal with our internal process type of model is that we have stable, well-controlled procedures and processes within our organization. We're kind of trying to achieve what has become very famously known in the past few decades as organizational harmony. So all the units, all the individuals, all the departments within our organization are all working in harmony in a very stable type of controlled environment. We manage communication and we manage information as a means to getting to this goal of stable processes and well-controlled processes. So our focus is on those actual processes within the organization. Again, so what? So we got 4 different models and 4 different ways of defining effectiveness. Again, the so what is each of our different theories we're going to cover in this class will fit into usually at least one of these boxes. They will emphasize one of these models of organizational effectiveness. Some will emphasize more than one, and there's actually one theory we'll talk about, at least one, that doesn't really emphasize any of these 4. It's a structural contingency approach. We'll get to that later in the semester. But the vast majority of our theories will fall into one of or 2 of these 4 boxes in our chart in terms of the ways in which they measure the effectiveness of the organization. So yeah, when you're talking something like next week, Max Weber and his classical approach, his approach is very much of a structured approach, but it was also very much of an approach on the goal of the organization. So I think you'll see Max Weber fit very nicely into a rational goal type of an approach. Somebody like a Frederick Taylor emphasizes more processes and more how jobs are being done, and so it'll fall more into a process-oriented type of model. So that's the first framework we're going to use. What model of organizational effectiveness is emphasized by this theory or by this school of thought? Then the second framework we're going to be using is Mintzberg's mechanisms for coordination and control. And you'll see that if you have the book on page 32. On 32, Tompkins gives us Mintzberg's different categories of his mechanisms. There are 6 different mechanisms for how we coordinate and control what goes on within our organization. Some of our theories and schools of thought will emphasize what Mintzberg calls mutual adjustment. Mutual adjustment is kind of a warmer, fuzzier, kinder way of controlling and coordinating the work that goes on in our organizations. We coordinate, we control work in mutual adjustment by allowing our employees the opportunity to collaborate together. We allow them to work together in groups to self-determine what they want to accomplish and how they want to accomplish it. So it's a very employer-friendly kind of bottom-up way of coordinating work within our organization. So when you have organizations that use a lot of work groups, they're probably using a mutual adjustment mechanism for coordination. The opposite of mutual adjustment, and mutual adjustment is something we're going to see a lot in the neoclassical theories that we will talk about. But diametrically opposed to that is the second mechanism, which is direct supervision, which is just what it sounds like. It's a top-down supervision where managers tell employees, this is what you do and this is how you do it. This is much more in line with the classical school of organization theory, people like Max Weber, people like Frederick Taylor. So you kind of got your polar opposites there in your first 2 mechanisms. Third mechanism is standardization of processes. So we standardize work processes, kind of like we do in scientific management. Here's the one best way to do the job. We standardize the job. Everyone then must do that job in that one standard way. We could control through the standardization of outputs. This is kind of similar to a quality management approach where we standardize the quality expectations of those outputs that we are creating as an organization, and we'll have empirical quality measurements for everything that we are creating. Again, works a lot better in the private sector than the public sector, but it's another way to control work in the organization. Standardization of skills. When we onboard people, we make sure they all have the same skills to then make them successful in the job. So everyone in a job classification will have the same set of skills when they enter that position classification. And standardization of values, making sure that employees in the organization share the same types of values. Obviously, the better they share their values, the more effective the organization can be. So another framework we'll use are these mechanisms for coordination and control. You already kind of see how some of the schools of thought utilize different types of mechanisms for control. And then our third framework we'll be using this semester is how organizations motivate their employees. And there are 4 different ways. There's legal compliance, there's instrumental rewards, there's job identification, and there's goal congruence or agreement. Legal compliance, we motivate employees with punitive measures. And so we motivate employees to show up on time for work, because if they are late for work, they may get docked pay, or they may end up getting a poor performance evaluation, which could then lead to very negative consequences in terms of their future employment in the organization. But we usually use compliance with legal standards, compliance with rules and regulations in order to motivate our employees. So it's a relatively negative way, oftentimes, of motivating employees. More positive way is through instrumental rewards, where we provide rewards for performance. So in the private sector, we can do this with money. In the public sector, we oftentimes cannot do it with money. So we have to do it more with things like recognition. So you can be Employee of the Week and recognized by your peers if you've done a good job completing this project on time. Another type of instrumental reward is what's called considerate leadership, where you pay attention to the wants and the needs of your employees. And you kind of take a more human resource type of an approach to how you manage your employees. And they are then motivated through your considerate leadership strategies. Another instrumental reward could be something like group acceptance, where you accept that people are social animals, kind of like what Elton Mayo told us. People are social, and so therefore their organizations need to be social as well. People sometimes are more productive when they are working in groups. So we need to recognize that groups exist within our organization, both formal as well as informal groups, and motivate our employees through allowing those groups to exist. Job identification is another method for motivating our employees. In job identification, we create jobs that our employees will identify with. So we talk to our employees and we ask them, what types of skills, what are you looking for in the next 5 years? What type of position do you want to be in the next 5 years? And then based upon what position they want, what types of skills do they need? And then let's help you develop those skills through your everyday job. So if you aspire to management, we're going to incorporate some management functions within your job to help you develop those managerial skills to move up the organizational ladder. The more people identify with their jobs and the content of their jobs, obviously the more motivated they will be to carry out those functions and hopefully do a good, effective job. And then the final one is goal congruence or goal agreement, the ability of the organization to find alignment between the goals of the organization and the goals of individual employees. Clearly, the more goal congruence you have between the goals of the organization and goals of employees, the more motivated those employees will be to provide contributions to the organization and to do a better job on a daily basis. As we go through our theories and our schools of thought, we'll see that some of them will emphasize legal compliance, like the classical theories. Some will emphasize instrumental rewards, HR, human resource, and even a little bit to Frederick Taylor and scientific management. Some will emphasize job identification, like a Douglas McGregor or Chris Ardress. And most of them will, at least the HR ones, will emphasize goal congruence, trying to find that middle ground between the goals of the organization and the goals of the employees. So those are the 3 main frameworks we are going to be using, and we'll use them again to then compare our different theories and find the threads that tie those theories together, as well as how our theories differ from each other among those 3 different frameworks. Is that all clear in terms of those 3 frameworks? Because it's something we're going to be using for the next 6 weeks. And you'll see, if you haven't gone ahead and read any of the future chapters, you'll see at the end of each chapter, Tompkins will then shade in those, like in the models of organizational effectiveness, will shade in one of those models that is really emphasized by Max Weber. One thing I will tell you, though, is that sometimes I do disagree with Tompkins. So just get a quick example for Max Weber. You'll see at the end of that chapter, he is shaded in, Tompkins is shaded in the bottom two. He is shaded in rational goal approach and internal process approach. Those are the two approaches that Weber usually emphasizes in terms of measuring the effectiveness of the organization. I happen to agree with that, but it's a great example when I disagree. But you'll see there are sometimes I disagree with Tompkins. And when I disagree with Tompkins, I'll illustrate that for you. When we talk about a theorist, if you disagree with Tompkins and you think that there's a different category that should be emphasized, that's something I want you to share. And I want you to think critically about this, because sometimes categorizing these theories and these theorists can sometimes be a little bit subjective in nature. So just keep in mind that what Tompkins says is not always gospel, and we may end up disagreeing with it throughout the course. I think I've probably talked long enough so far this evening, and you're probably sick of hearing my voice. And so it's 7:20. Let's go ahead and let's take a break. Let's take about a 10-minute break. And then when we come back from the break, we're going to do breakout groups. And I have a quick little assignment we can do in our breakout groups. So let's come back from break at 7:30, and then I'll assign you to breakout groups and talk you through what we're doing and give you about half an hour to work on that. Then we'll reconvene as a class at about 8 o'clock. Share what we came up with, and then call it a night. So take a break to 7:30, come on back, and we'll do our breakout groups. Okay, welcome back. We are at 7:31. I thought I'd give you an extra minute back because I know I talked over 1 minute of your break, so I didn't want to cheat you out of any time. It was a short break as it was, but I went ahead, I created breakout groups. And so what we'll be doing is I'm going to create 4 breakout groups, about 5 folks in each. And what I want each group to do is to discuss your organizations, whether it be hopefully public, but if you're in a private organization, reverse this logic, but discuss your organizations and then identify 2 characteristics that are common among your organizations that would make it difficult for you to apply private organization theories to your organization. So 2 characteristics in your organizations are kind of similar across all of the organizations you have. 2 things that would make it difficult for you to apply a private organization theory. So in other words, essentially you're looking at 2 main differences between your public organization and a corollary organization in the private sector that would make it difficult to apply a private organization theory. But we're probably going to spend, we'll say until about 8 o'clock working on this. I think that'll be more than enough time. One thing I would ask each group to do is to select a spokesperson, either someone volunteers or they get voluntold by the group to do it, and have a spokesperson, because at 8 o'clock, I'll close up the breakout groups. We'll reconvene as a class. I'll have each group then share out the 2 characteristics that you came up with, see what types of similarities and differences we have. And then when we're done sharing out, we will call a night. So that's the plan. Any questions about the breakout groups? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open up the groups now, and then you can have at it. Okay, it's just after 8 o'clock, so we are back, and let's reconvene and see what each room came up with. So let's start with room number 1. I think that's Perla, Monica, Luis, Jocelyn.
Good evening, Professor. This is Perla. I'll go ahead and I'll share on behalf of my group. And so pretty much all of us, we work for a organization in the public sector. So we did go over some of the information that we discussed earlier in class, and some of the differences that we came across that we probably wouldn't be able to apply. Private organization theories apply to the public ones. One of them was in regards of the performance measurement and rewards. And that's because for the public organizations that we work with, a lot of them, right, have very set raises based on the classification. So they're not very easy to negotiate in terms of annual raises or even just adjustments. So we did find that in the private sector, it's a lot easier based on your qualifications or maybe even education to do that, more so than you would in a public sector agency. We also looked at some of the different goals and objectives. So for the for-profit sector, they're more looking at, let's say, the monetary gains. They're looking more at the financial aspects of the organization, versus those in the public sector are more service delivery driven. So it's more in the terms of what service are they delivering to the public, whether that be to reduce homelessness or offer food stamps, any type of service delivery. That's how they determine those goals and objectives. So they're more soft goals and objectives versus those profits for the private sector. Some of the other ones that we looked at were also in terms of funding. So the limitations of the private sector in terms of funding, because the public sector does have more of that flexibility in terms of their allocations that they receive on a every fiscal year that they can anticipate to receive, versus what the private sector kind of has to work with. And then we also looked at the terms, the internal processes. So the agencies that we worked with, our procedures are a little bit different because ours is more geared based off the legal, maybe mandates in place and the requirements that we have to abide by, and also just the certain level of transparency that we have to take into consideration. Because we are working with the public, we have to make sure that certain parties are taken into account, and also given an opportunity to voice their concerns. So those are the high level of just some of the ones that we talked about, and the difference between the public and the private sectors.
Great, thank you, Perla. Very well done, very comprehensive. And yeah, those obviously are all accurate. And the first one in terms of performance and being able to pay for performance, yeah, that's a big one, and we're going to see how that plays out in a lot of schools of thought we talked about this semester. And in the public sector, as you discussed, you've got position classifications, and so if we make a decision to change position classification or do a classification study, the classification study is not oriented around an employee's performance, as you pointed out. It's oriented around the nature of the job and the functions and tasks of the job change. And so those classification studies are done primarily for changes in jobs. And then what you end up seeing is you oftentimes end up seeing this domino effect where you do a classification study for one position, that position then gets reclassified, then it starts bumping up in a compensation perspective, bumping into the classification above it. And then there's a job above it that the incumbent then says, well, I want my job reclassified, and so on and so on. And sometimes you do one classification for one position can turn into classification studies across the entire organization. And those are, or if you've ever participated in those are very time consuming, and they can be relatively expensive to do as well. So I think that's a great point. They were all great points. One of the advantages the private sector has, as you had talked about being profit driven, is that you've got a pricing mechanism there, and so they can really price according to demand. And so they look at the demand for their good, and if the demand is going up, then they can increase their prices and kind of find that supply and demand balance point. Obviously, in the public sector, we don't have that, and so sometimes we try and do shadow pricing and some other types of strategies to help us determine the supply that needs to be created. But the problem with that is that we have so many free riders for certain types of public goods that you have people who are deriving benefits without bearing any of the burden for paying for it. And so you really can't use demand as a surrogate for deciding how much of a public good to produce. So it really kind of puts us in a quandary in terms of trying to use supply and demand curves for the production of public goods. But all excellent points, very well done. So thank you, Perla. How about room number two?
Yes, I'll speak on behalf of group number two. We had people from Social Services Department, UCLA, City of La Palma, like Recreation, Public Works, Torrance Finance. So each of them had like different aspects of it, because one of the things that we all agreed was that the time to hire, usually it takes between 4 to 6 months. There was one exception that one organization was filling up positions within 2 months. That was and then they are also having a huge retirement crisis right now. And then we spoke about the performance measures, like we have particular forms that we fill, and then we are structured into falling into one of those categories. And there is not much room to improve, and it depends on your supervisor's input. And the other aspect we discussed was like our income, sources of income, and with this significant increase in the cost of materials, the increases in the utility services provided and the taxes that we want to achieve. So, in order to get that tax increase, it's been like it has taken more than a year in some organizations to even bring that into statute and get the approval from the city council. And then we talked about the guidelines of determining eligibility into jobs. Then also about the street level bureaucracy. We had people from the Recreation Department and the Social Services Department that deals one-on-one with the with customers, that they are governed by, they are given some guidelines to determine the eligibility and then go on. This specifically speaking about the social services. And the other approach was about bonuses and incentives that is usually given to private sector. Now, in our cases, we are locked into certain bargaining agreements. Our annual increases are blocked. Once you reach the higher tier, your tiers, you don't progress on your pay increases in your pay. You're locked. You're only given a cost of living adjustment. But then for us who are locked in for the next 3 years in our bargaining agreements, our pay has only gone up by 2%. But then the cost of living in LA County around has gone between 6 to 8%. So we don't have the incentive like in a private sector to go back and negotiate and get a higher pay. And the other thing we spoke about was the retirement structures, which each of us have different retirement. So the newer people have less incentive to work in private sector, in public sector, and there would be like a constant people moving in and out, because there is no incentive like in the older system to be hold on to your position, because your retirement age is not much different from the private sector.
Very good, excellent. Again, very comprehensive list. Thank you, Faisal. Just to pick up on a couple of those points, the first one you mentioned in terms of retirement, we have been waiting for this retirement hit to come for quite a while. And I know I've been at Long Beach now for 21 years, which I find hard to believe. But in my 21 years, it seems like every year we've been talking about this big retirement bubble that's coming, especially at the federal level, and to a somewhat lesser degree at the state and local level as well. And it wasn't really hitting. And then we got COVID. And I think that in the wake of COVID, I think this bubble is really starting to burst in terms of retirements. And I think that's going to be a huge challenge for a lot of organizations to try and fill those positions, especially when they're competing against private sector corporations. Because as you point out, in the private sector, in terms of compensation packages, you can get paid more, you might have more attractive retirement benefits, especially since the public sector is really starting to scale back those retirement benefits for new employees. It makes it really difficult to compete with private sector corporations for that very limited talent pool in that labor pool. And so it's going to be increasingly difficult for public organizations to fill those positions. And you also mentioned in terms of price increases. That's a really important point for a lot of, especially local governments. It takes us a long time because of all the procedures we need to follow to implement our capital projects. And so we may approve a capital project, but it doesn't actually get implemented for many, many months. And the problem is we have cost escalation. And those cost escalation percentages in some cities are running upwards of 40 or 50% between when the project is approved and when the project is finished. In the private sector, those projects can get done a lot quicker because you don't have the same approval mechanisms, you don't have the same requirements for competitive bidding as you have in the procurement process in the public sector. And whenever you have a situation where you have cost escalation of 20 or 30 or 40%, that original project that you had envisioned when it was passed by the legislative body is probably going to end up looking a whole lot different because you don't have enough revenue to carry out that initial project. And that cost escalation is killing a lot of these public capital projects. And so that's another great point. So excellent. Thank you very much. Room number 3.
Sorry, which one was room number 3? I don't know if that's us or not.
3 is Jake, Janine, Jelani, Sam, Steve.
Oh, I'll take it. Sorry, I didn't know we were group 3. So we had a discussion and kind of compared all of our organizations and kind of overlapped the 2 characteristics that we felt would make it difficult to apply like private organization theory. And the 2 that stood out the most to us was one, the management cultures. And so in all of our organizations, we all had kind of like a very top-down leadership management culture. And in the private industry, they have more freedom to be more creative and have like a bottom up or even like a mid-lateral management leadership theory. And that's just not the case for any of us. And then the second characteristic that was very prevalent in all of our organizations was that it's so much harder to get things done in a timely manner because of all the processes and approvals and firm policies and things that are required, bidding and that stuff. There's just so much more red tape in public organizations than there are in private. Those are the 2 things that stood out to us the most.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Steve. I agree. And obviously, when you're talking about organization culture, or actually management culture, and you're talking about the organizational chart, I think you're absolutely right. Is that there's a lot of more room for maneuverability in private sector organizations than there will be in public sector organizations. And in private sector organizations, we see a lot of private organization theories that favor cross-functionality, and cross-functional training, which is much easier to do in a private corporation than it is to do in a public organization with our relatively rigid position classifications. You try to do cross-functionality, and then you have people who are working outside their description. They're working outside their description, that gives a grounds for grievance, or at the very least, a meet and confer between administration and the union. And so it becomes much more difficult to have that type of flexibility. And I agree with that. And obviously, in terms of the policies and procedures, what we lovingly refer to as red tape really does slow things down in the public sector. And, the competitive bidding process and, just the entire procurement process, tends to be a lot slower and more protracted in the public sector. And so, yeah, I think those are 2 very important differences that weigh very heavily on the application of private organization theories to public organizations. So thank you, Steve. Well done. Good job, group 3. And room number 4.
Hi, this is Christina. Some of the things we talked about, which other groups have already touched on, were the HR and performance measurements, and specifically how difficult it would be to get rid of an employee in the public sector should they not meet performance criteria. I did want to specify as I'm the nonprofit person is we don't have that problem. They're happy to let you go at any point. So in that way, we're similar to the private company. We also spoke at length about goals and objectives being different. So, and this varies across whatever organization we're at, but Generally speaking, our goals and objectives may be more vague, a little bit more lofty and less tangible. So our outcomes and outputs may not be clearly defined. So specifically, one of the cohorts works for the LA Superior Court. So a lot of their goal is to guide clients through the process. So the metrics aren't so clear cut as, we're providing this many services or providing this tangible good. And then there's also a difference in procedural and regulatory limitations. So a lot of public agencies are limited to what they can do and how they can do it based on laws, procedures, regulatory limitations like CEQA and other environmental issues and laws, whereas private industries are not so constrained. Another one was obviously politics. Bernie brought up that a lot of what they do, like it or not, can be swayed by political promises, political ambitions, or just narratives. And whereas a private agency is not.
Great. Thank you, Christina. And yeah, I agree with Bernie's comment. I always tell my budgeting class that the old adage is political imperatives always outweigh economic imperatives or trump economic imperatives, which is true. So they can make a great deal of fiscal and practical sense. If it doesn't make political sense for an elected official, it's probably just not going to happen. So we always have to remember we're in that political environment. Your point about at-will employees is also an extremely important one, because that really underpins a lot of these differences between private and public organization theories. Next week we'll talk a lot about Frederick Taylor and scientific management. And one of the parts of scientific management is if you have an employee who is considered to be a cog in the machinery of the organization, if that employee is not performing well, then you consider it as the cog is broken. You take out the broken cog, you throw it away, and you replace it with another cog, another employee. You can do that much more readily when you have at-will employees. When you have civil service employees, you're not able to do that. You can get rid of a civil service employee, but it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of documentation. It's going to take documented subpar evaluations, followed by documented availability of training and development opportunities, followed by more performance evaluations, followed by more documented training and development opportunities, and so on and so on. So it is certainly a major difference, and one of the reasons why it became relatively difficult to take a scientific management approach and apply it as a panacea for a lot of our public organizations. The procedures and processes, as you had mentioned accurately, they're just so much more difficult. And there are so many more procedures and policies. You had mentioned CEQA, which is a great example, that even if you can get a CEQA waiver, what you have to go through to get that CEQA waiver is going to cost you money. To get the consultant to produce the CEQA waiver application for your project could cost you tens of thousands of dollars just to get CEQA waived. And so it's not only a time intensive, but it's also a very resource intensive process to even avoid CEQA. And so all excellent points. I think all four groups, that's exactly what I'm looking for. I think you've illustrated some of the differences very well. And this is an important point, because as we move forward with our discussion of the different schools of thought, a lot of the theories we're going to talk about did originate in the public sector, and they were applied to, they did originate in the private sector, I should say, in the world of business, and they were applied to private sector organizations first. Then we took them and we tried to just apply them directly to public sector organizations, and we found it didn't work. If we're going to use a private sector theory, we're going to have to modify and tweak it to make it fit the unique characteristics of the public sector and public sector organizations. And so this discussion you had in your groups and this kind of debriefing that we just had over the past 20 minutes is important, because it's something that's going to follow us through in our discussion of private theories moving on for the next several weeks. So perfect. Thank you very much. Worked out exactly how I hoped it would. That's what I have for you tonight. Again, this was just to kind of create the framework of what is organization theory, how we study organizations, the different frameworks we're going to use from Tompkins to compare our different theories and schools of thought. Next week, we'll actually get into a discussion in earnest of the different schools of thought. Next week will be classical, and so next week we'll talk about ideal bureaucracies and scientific management. We'll talk about the principal school and people like Luther Gulick. We'll talk about Henri Fayol and some of his approaches to kind of a classical approach to studying organizations. Do all that next week, use the same approach. First part of class, we'll talk about the theories and the material, take a break, and then the second part of class, we will do our breakout rooms. Remember that by Sunday, you have to post your response to discussion board number 1, along with responses to 2 classmates. Okay. All right, that's all I have for tonight. I look forward to working with you through the rest of the semester, quote unquote, semester together. Any questions at all, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a great week. I'll have this recording up onto our Beachboard site by either late tonight or tomorrow morning, and I'll see you again next Monday night. Take care, everyone. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Night.
Good night, Professor.
Good night.